They blamed me first. They always did. Before you know my name, before you know what I did, or how long I stayed, you should know that simple truth. When something broke, when a deadline slipped, when a mistake embarrassed someone important, the finger didn't wander far. It landed on me, on the oldest woman in the room, on the one who didn't argue back. My name is Dolores Claiborne, and I gave that company 30 years of my life. 30 years of showing up early, staying late, fixing things quietly, and keeping my mouth shut when it would have been easier to scream. And for most of that time, I believed what they wanted me to believe, that I was lucky to still have a job, that age made me slow, that silence meant safety. If you're listening to this and you're over 50, you already know how this starts. You feel it before anyone says it out loud. The way conversations stop when you enter the room. The way younger voices talk over yours. The way mistakes stick to you longer than they stick to anyone else. At first, it was subtle. A raised eyebrow from Mr. Harlan, the senior manager who liked to pretend he was fair. A sigh from Vivian Price, young enough to be my daughter, already promoted twice while I trained her how things actually worked. They never said, "It's because you're old." They didn't have to. Their tone did the work for them. "Dolores will handle it," they'd say when something went wrong. Not because I caused the problem, but because I always fixed it. Quietly, efficiently, without recognition. And when the fix didn't come fast enough, that's when the blame arrived. I learned early that blame is lighter when it falls on someone who won't throw it back. There were meetings where my name was used like a warning. Let's not do it the way Dolores did last time. No one asked me what actually happened. No one asked why the system failed or why the instructions changed halfway through. They just nodded and moved on, relieved it wasn't their turn. And I let them. That's the part that still stings. I let them because I needed the job, because I was raising a child, because at my age, starting over wasn't a brave idea. It was a dangerous one. So I stayed. I endured. I became dependable in the most invisible way possible. Years passed like that. Decades, really. New faces came in. Old ones moved up. I stayed right where I was, holding things together with memory and habit. I knew which machines acted up in the winter. I knew which suppliers cut corners. I knew which shortcuts saved time and which ones caused disasters a week later. They didn't call that experience. They called it just what Dolores does. And when something finally couldn't be fixed quietly, when a problem became too big, too public, too embarrassing, they did what they'd trained themselves to do. They blamed me first. I remember one afternoon clearly. The room was full. Everyone was there. Mr. Harlan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just said my name and paused. That pause told the room everything it needed to know. Heads turned. Eyes landed on me. No one defended me. Not one. I went home that night and sat in the dark longer than usual. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just thought about how easy it had been for them. How natural. How practiced. That was the night I realized something important, something that would change everything later on. They weren't blaming me because I was useless. They were blaming me because I was convenient. If this sounds familiar, if you've ever carried other people's failures just to keep the peace, stay with me. And if you've ever been blamed just for surviving long enough to grow old, I want you to listen closely to what comes next. I wasn't hired to be a fixer. That just became my job when everyone else failed. When I first started, the place was smaller, louder, and far less polished. People actually asked questions back then. They listened. I was younger too, stronger in the back, quicker in the hands, still believing that effort earned respect. I didn't mind learning everything from the ground up. I liked knowing how things worked. I liked being useful. What I didn't realize was that usefulness, when paired with silence, turns into expectation. And expectation turns into entitlement. It started with small things. Someone forgets a step, and I catch it before it spreads. A schedule gets tangled, and I straighten it out during my lunch break. A system freezes, and I already know the trick to restart it because I've seen it fail 100 times before. No announcements. No thanks. Just a nod, if that. Soon, people stopped trying as hard. Why would they? Dolores would handle it. That's what Vivian Price used to say, smiling as if it were a compliment. She was bright, confident, and always in a hurry. She came in with new ideas, big words, and a voice that filled rooms. I trained her when she arrived, showed her what wasn't written down, what didn't show up in manuals. She listened just long enough to move ahead of me. When things went right, she took credit without blinking. When things went wrong, she glanced my way. It was subtle, always subtle. That's how they get away with it. Mr. Harlan was worse in a quieter way. He liked order, liked control, liked having someone beneath him who never challenged his version of events. I fit that role perfectly. Older, reliable, replaceable in his mind. Whenever something needed smoothing over, he didn't ask. I was told, Dolores, can you take care of this? Dolores, you know how this works. Dolores, we'll need you to stay a little late. I stayed. I always stayed. What people don't understand is that fixing things doesn't just mean solving problems. It means absorbing blame, so others don't have to. It means knowing which corners to reinforce before they collapse. It means remembering who forgot what, even when everyone else pretends not to notice. I carried all of that, not because I wanted power, but because I wanted peace. As the years went on, the job didn't get harder, but the respect got thinner. My name stopped being used with warmth. It became shorthand, a label. If someone said, "This looks like a Dolores issue," everyone knew what that meant. No investigation, no discussion, just assumption. I watched younger employees make the same mistakes I'd once been scolded for. Only now, those mistakes were called learning experiences. Mine had been called failures. There's a special kind of humiliation in fixing a problem while someone else explains it incorrectly to the room. I lived inside that feeling for years, standing there, knowing the truth, knowing the cause, knowing the solution, and saying nothing because saying something would only make it worse. I learned how to disappear while still doing the work. By the time I reached my late 50s, people didn't even pretend anymore. They'd drop problems on my desk without eye contact. They'd schedule meetings and forget to invite me, then ask later why something hadn't been addressed. If I reminded them, they acted surprised, as if I should have known anyway. That's when it became clear they didn't see me as a person. I was a safety net, a quiet one, and safety nets aren't thanked. They're only noticed when they're gone. I want you to understand this part, especially if you've lived it yourself. I wasn't bitter back then. I wasn't plotting anything. I was tired in a deep, bone-level way that comes from giving more than you receive for too long. I told myself it was fine, that I was doing the right thing, that endurance was strength. What I didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that every fix I made was teaching them how much they could get away with. And one day, that lesson would cost them everything. Blame is simple. Respect takes effort. I learned that lesson the hard way, watching it play out day after day in rooms where my voice no longer mattered. Respect requires listening, patience, and the uncomfortable act of admitting someone else knows more than you. Blame, on the other hand, only needs a target, and I had become the easiest one they could find. It didn't happen all at once. That's how people excuse it later. They say, it wasn't that bad at first. But erosion doesn't start with a collapse. It starts with a drip. The jokes came before the accusations. Little comments dressed up as humor. Dolores probably remembers when we did it this way. Let's check with Dolores. She's been here since the dinosaurs. The room would laugh. I would smile. That smile became part of my uniform. What hurt wasn't the words. It was the permission those words gave everyone else. Once age became something they could laugh at, it became something they could dismiss. Once they dismissed me, it became easier to pin things on me. Meetings changed. When something failed, the conversation skipped straight past the process and landed on the person, on me. No one asked what had changed. No one asked who approved the shortcut. They just looked in my direction, waiting. And if I spoke up, if I tried to explain, the air in the room shifted. Eyes rolled. Pens tapped. Vivian would cut in gently, sweetly, like she was doing me a favor. We've already moved past that, Dolores. Moved past the truth. Straight into blame. Public humiliation doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, right in front of everyone. It's being corrected when you're right. It's being ignored when you speak. It's watching someone else repeat your idea 10 minutes later and get praised for it. I watched that happen so many times I stopped counting. There was one morning when a mistake cost the department an entire day of work. It wasn't mine. I knew exactly when it happened and who caused it. I could have said it. I could have defended myself. Instead, I stayed quiet, waiting for the truth to surface on its own. It didn't. Mr. Harlan cleared his throat and said my name like a conclusion. Dolores, we need to be more careful. No evidence. No questions. Just blame, neatly wrapped and handed to me. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not into anger. Anger burns out too fast. This was colder. Heavier. I realized they weren't interested in accuracy. They were interested in comfort. And blaming me kept everyone else comfortable. You see, when you blame the elderly, you don't have to fix the system. You don't have to admit you rushed or skipped steps or didn't listen. You just say the word mistake, attach it to a familiar face, and move on. I became that familiar face. In the break room, conversations stopped when I walked in. Not because I was disliked, but because I reminded them of something they didn't want to face. Time. Mortality. The fact that one day they would be me. So they distanced themselves. Blame creates distance. Respect creates connection. They chose distance every time. I started writing things down. Not formally. Not for evidence. Just notes in my head. Patterns. Reactions. Who blamed first? Who stayed silent? Who benefited? I didn't know why I was doing it. I just knew I was paying attention now. If you're listening to this and nodding along, I want you to hear this clearly. The problem was never your ability. It was their need for a convenient answer. Blame is easier than respect. That's why they chose it. And that choice would come back to them, quietly at first, just like it had with me. The realization didn't come during an argument or a dramatic moment. It came on a quiet afternoon when everything almost fell apart. One of the systems stalled. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. Just a slow, creeping failure that stopped work without announcing itself. People panicked because no one understood why it was happening. Screens froze. Phones rang. Voices rose. Vivian paced, tapping her pen against her palm like confidence might shake an answer loose. I watched for a while before anyone noticed me. Then someone said my name, not with blame this time, with urgency. Dolores, do you know what's going on? I walked over, looked once, and told them exactly where the problem was. Not because I was smarter, but because I'd seen it before. I knew which warning signs were lies and which ones mattered. I knew the history, the shortcuts, the habits. I fixed it in minutes. The room exhaled. Smiles returned. Phone stopped ringing. And just like that, the moment passed. No thanks. No acknowledgement. Vivian stepped in and explained the solution as if it had appeared out of thin air. That's when it hit me. They didn't keep me around because I was slow or replaceable. They kept me because I was essential. I was the memory of the place, the unspoken manual, the one person who knew how everything connected. And they hated that. Dependence makes people uncomfortable, especially when it points upward instead of down. They needed me, but they couldn't respect me without admitting they'd been wrong for years. So they balanced the scale by blaming me whenever they could. That way, they could need me without owing me. Once I saw that, everything looked different. I noticed how often they came to my desk without witnesses, how they lowered their voices when they asked for help, how Mr. Harlan avoided my eyes in public, but leaned on my knowledge in private, how Vivian asked me questions framed as suggestions, then repeated my answers as decisions. I realized something else too. If I ever stopped doing what I did, if I ever stopped fixing, smoothing, correcting, the place wouldn't just struggle. It would unravel. Not because I was special, but because no one else had bothered to learn. That wasn't power I had asked for. It was power I had inherited through neglect. I went home that night and stood in my kitchen longer than usual thinking about that word. Power. I'd never associated it with myself. Power belonged to loud people, confident people, people with titles. But there I was, holding something fragile together every day without anyone noticing. I didn't plan revenge. I didn't fantasize about walking out. I just made one quiet decision. I stopped overextending. I did my job, exactly my job. Nothing more. No shortcuts. No late nights. No silent rescues. The cracks appeared faster than I expected. Small delays, confusion, repeated questions, the same mistakes happening twice, then 3 times. They started looking at each other instead of at me, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty in their faces. They didn't blame me yet. Not openly. They were still pretending everything was fine. But I knew they needed me far more than they wanted to admit. And one day soon, whether I spoke or stayed silent, that truth would surface. If you've ever realized your worth only after being treated as disposable, hold on to that feeling. It's not bitterness. It's clarity. And clarity, at my age, is a dangerous thing. They didn't hide their relief when I told them I was retiring. That was the part that hurt the most. I stood there, hands folded, voice steady, explaining that after 30 years, it was time. I didn't ask for praise. I didn't expect applause. I only hoped foolishly for a pause, a moment of acknowledgement, something to mark the weight of all those years. Instead, I saw smiles, quick ones, careless ones. Vivian said, "Good for you," in a tone people use when a burden lifts. Mr. Harlan nodded and said, "Well, we'll manage. Not we'll miss you. Not thank you. Just we'll manage." That's when I knew exactly how they saw me. The retirement gathering was small and rushed. A cake from a grocery store down the street. My name spelled wrong in icing. People checking their watches while I stood there, feeling like an obligation instead of a person. Someone joked about how I'd finally get to slow down. I smiled. Of course I did. No speech was planned. So Vivian said a few words off the top of her head. She talked about teamwork, about moving forward, about change. She didn't mention what I'd done. She didn't mention how often she'd come to me when no one was looking. When it was over, they went back to work. Just like that, I was erased. As I walked out for the last time, no one followed me to the door. No one asked if I'd be okay. No one wondered what would happen next. They thought the problem had solved itself. I heard someone say, half joking, maybe things will run smoother now. I didn't turn around. At home, I sat in my chair and listened to the quiet, not the peaceful kind, the heavy kind, the kind that settles in your chest when something ends without meaning. I thought about all the mornings I'd woken up early, all the lunches eaten alone, all the blame I'd swallowed just to keep the wheels turning. And I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because I was free of them, but because I was free of pretending. They thought retirement was the end of my usefulness. They thought the cracks they'd been ignoring would magically seal themselves. They believed what they'd always believed, that Dolores was the problem. What they didn't understand was simple. I hadn't taken my value with me. I'd taken their safety net. And the moment I walked through that door, the countdown began, even if none of them knew it yet. It didn't fall apart all at once. That's not how things collapse when they've been held together quietly for years. At first, it was small. So small they could pretend it wasn't happening. A delay here, a missed detail there, a task redone because someone misunderstood how it was supposed to flow. They blamed the learning curve, new routines, adjustments. Change always needs time, they said. I heard all of this secondhand. Former coworkers still called me sometimes, not to ask how I was, but to talk, to complain, to reassure themselves. I listened politely. I said very little. 3 weeks after I left, a process I used to manage in my head without notes, without reminders went wrong. Not catastrophically, just enough to cost time and embarrass the wrong people. Vivian tried to explain it away in a meeting, but someone asked a question she couldn't answer. Why didn't we catch this earlier? Silence followed. They didn't say my name yet. Not out loud, but I could feel it hovering, like a ghost they didn't want to acknowledge. Mr. Harlan started staying later. That alone told me something was wrong. He had never stayed late unless there was trouble. He began asking questions no one could answer. Questions I'd answered 100 times before without anyone noticing. Another week passed. Another problem surfaced. This one caused frustration instead of embarrassment. Phones rang longer. People snapped at each other. A system failed in a way that didn't make sense unless you knew its history. They didn't. That history was me. The younger staff worked harder, not smarter. They followed instructions without understanding why they existed. They corrected symptoms instead of causes. And every fix created 2 more problems downstream. I imagine them standing where I used to stand, staring at the same screens, feeling the same pressure, only without the quiet confidence of knowing how it all fit together. That was when the tone changed. The jokes stopped. The smiles faded. Meetings grew tense. Vivian's voice lost its certainty. Mr. Harlan started interrupting people, searching for control he no longer had. Still, no one reached out to me. Pride is a stubborn thing, especially when it's been fed for years by the belief that experience is replaceable. I could have helped. I knew exactly what was wrong. I knew how to stop it from spreading, but something in me had finally learned its lesson. I had already given enough for free. The cracks widened slowly, almost politely, enough to be noticed, not enough to be admitted. And as I sat at home, sipping my coffee in the morning light, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. I felt steady. They were still standing. But now, for the first time, they were standing without me. And they didn't yet realize how fragile that made them. At first, my name returned like a rumor. Soft, careful, almost embarrassed. I heard it through old coworkers who still had my number saved, the ones who'd never been cruel, just quiet. They'd call and lower their voices, even though I wasn't there. They mentioned you today. One of them said, just in passing. Another added, as if that made it better. In meetings, someone would say, Dolores used to handle this, and the room would go still. No one laughed anymore. No one made jokes about age or dinosaurs. My name had lost its humor, but something else had taken its place. Blame. When the second major failure happened, the tone shifted sharply. It wasn't just inconvenience now. It was visible, noticeable, hard to explain away. Vivian tried to frame it as a miscommunication, but Mr. Harlan cut her off. This never happened before, he said. Everyone knew what he meant. They started saying my name like an accusation again. Only this time, I wasn't there to absorb it. That made them uncomfortable. You can't blame someone properly when they're not in the room to carry it. Still, they tried. She must not have shown anyone how to do this. She should have documented it better. She left us unprepared. I listened to these stories with a strange calm, not satisfaction, not anger, just recognition. They were doing what they'd always done, protecting themselves. What they couldn't admit was that they'd never asked me to document anything. They'd never slowed down long enough to learn. They'd assumed I'd always be there, fixing things quietly, filling gaps without complaint. It's easy to blame the elderly for not passing on knowledge after you've spent years ignoring them. The pressure inside the company grew. People stopped volunteering ideas. Everyone became cautious. When something went wrong, they looked for a name to attach to it. Mine was the most familiar, but the world outside didn't see it that way. Clients noticed delays. Partners noticed inconsistencies. Questions started coming from places Mr. Harlan couldn't silence with authority alone. Vivian grew defensive. Her confidence cracked in public. And still, no one called me directly. That told me everything. They didn't want my help. They wanted my silence to continue carrying their failures. But silence doesn't work once the person who held it together is gone. One afternoon, a former coworker said something that stayed with me. They keep asking how you did it, she told me, but they never ask you. I laughed then, a short, surprised laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so familiar. They wanted the benefit of my experience without facing the way they'd treated me. They wanted the results without the reckoning. That's when I understood something important. The truth was already surfacing. I didn't need to push it. I didn't need to expose anyone. All I had to do was remain exactly where I was, gone. And as my name echoed through rooms I no longer stood in, it changed meaning. It was no longer the name of someone to blame. It was the name of someone they should never have ignored. Problems stopped staying inside the building. Delays reached people who weren't patient. Mistakes showed up where excuses didn't work. What had once been manageable chaos turned into something public. That's when panic replaced pride. Meetings became longer and less productive. Voices rose. Fingers pointed. Vivian tried to take control, but her words no longer carried weight. She repeated plans, revised timelines, promised fixes she didn't fully understand. Mr. Harlan stopped pretending this was temporary. For the first time in years, leadership looked unsure. Not confused, but exposed. They had built their authority on the assumption that someone else would always catch the fall. And now, there was no one beneath them to land on. People started quitting, quietly at first. The ones who sensed the shift, who knew when to step away before the damage spread. Each departure made things worse. Each empty desk widened the gaps I used to bridge without being asked. Outside the company, people noticed. Questions came that couldn't be redirected. The phrase internal issues stopped working. Explanations contradicted each other. Trust began to erode. And that's when something unexpected happened. Someone said my name out loud, not in blame, not in frustration, in curiosity. I heard Dolores used to manage this whole flow, Someone said in a room full of people, "Is that true?" No one answered immediately because the answer was yes, and saying it meant admitting everything that came after was their own doing. That silence spoke louder than any accusation ever had. Stories started circulating, not from me, from people who had watched quietly the way I had, people who remembered how often I was pulled aside to fix things, how often I stayed late, how rarely I was credited. The narrative shifted. It didn't flip overnight. It tilted, slowly, uneasily, but once it moved, it couldn't be forced back. Suddenly, my absence wasn't a convenience. It was a liability. Vivian grew sharper, more defensive. The confidence she'd worn like armor cracked in public. What they were experiencing wasn't punishment. It was exposure. Exposure to the truth they'd spent years avoiding, that experience matters, that memory matters, that the people you overlook are often the ones holding everything together. And once that truth became visible, there was no hiding it. The collapse wasn't total. Not yet. But it was undeniable. And for the first time, the story was no longer about my failure. It was about my absence. Questions started flying around once again, quiet but sharp enough to cut through everything else. Who handled this before? No one answered right away. By then, silence had become a habit whenever the truth made people uncomfortable. But this silence was different. It wasn't protective. It was exposed. Everyone in that room knew the answer. They just didn't know how to say it without admitting what they'd done. Finally, someone said my name. Dolores. Not with blame. Not with humor. Just a fact. That single word shifted something. Because once my name was spoken like that, plain, undeniable, it opened a door they'd spent years keeping shut. People started remembering out loud. She used to catch this before it spread. She always knew where the bottleneck was. She warned us about this months ago. Each sentence landed like weight. Not on me, but on the people who had dismissed me. Vivian tried to regain control. She said processes had changed, that the company was evolving, that no single person should be responsible for so much. And she was right. No one should have been, but I had been, because it was easier to lean on me than to build something better. That's when someone else asked the question no one wanted to hear next. Why didn't we listen to her? That one didn't get answered at all. From that point on, the story rewrote itself without my involvement. What had once been framed as my inadequacy became their oversight. What had been painted as my slowness became their dependence. And the people who had stayed silent all those years, people like me, began to speak. Not angrily, not dramatically, just honestly. It wasn't long after that when they finally reached out. The call came in the early afternoon, an unfamiliar number, but I recognized the pause on the line before anyone spoke. That hesitation told me exactly who it was. Dolores, Mr. Harlan said, careful, measured, as if choosing the right tone could undo years of the wrong ones. We were hoping to talk. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't agree. He talked about challenges, about transitions, about how things were different now. He didn't apologize, not directly. People rarely do when pride has lived too long in the same place. Vivian sent a message later. Short, polite, professional. She said they were reassessing processes and wondered if I'd be willing to share some insights. Insights. That word sat heavy with me. For 30 years, I had given them freely, quietly, without being asked. Now, they wanted them neatly packaged, handed back like something they could finally respect. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted them to suffer, not because I felt owed, but because something had shifted inside me when I left that building for the last time. I had learned that My worth did not depend on their recognition. They had looked for me when it was convenient to blame me. They had ignored me when it was time to listen. And now, when the consequences were theirs to carry, they wanted my voice back. Too late. I spent that afternoon walking outside, feeling the sun on my face, thinking about all the times I'd swallowed words to keep peace, about how often I'd chosen quiet over dignity. Age had given me something they never expected. Clarity. Clarity tells you when a chapter is finished, even if others want to reread it. It tells you when your presence is no longer a gift, but a crutch. They didn't need me anymore. They needed what I represented, and that was something they could never reclaim. As the days passed, the calls stopped. The messages slowed. The noise faded. And in that quiet, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Respect. Not from them. From myself. There's something I need you to understand, especially if you're listening to this with gray in your hair and years behind your eyes. I didn't win because I planned revenge. I didn't win because I fought back. I won because the truth finally caught up to them. For most of my life, I believed what they wanted me to believe, that getting older meant getting smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. I thought survival meant endurance, that dignity meant silence. I was wrong. Age didn't take anything from me. It revealed what I had always been carrying. They ignored me for 30 years because it was convenient, because I made their lives easier while making myself smaller. And when I finally stepped away, they didn't lose a worker. They lost the foundation they never bothered to acknowledge. Here's the part no one tells you when you get older. Being ignored is not the same as being powerless. Silence is not the same as ignorance. And experience, real experience, doesn't expire just because someone younger speaks louder. They didn't fire me. They didn't defeat me. They survived because of me and failed without me. If you've ever been talked over, dismissed, blamed, or made to feel invisible because of your age, this story isn't just mine. It's yours too. And I want you to remember this. The people who underestimate you are often standing on something you built. One day, they'll notice. Not because you shout. Not because you beg for recognition. But because what you carried quietly is suddenly gone. And when that day comes, you won't need to say a word. If this story felt familiar, if it felt personal, I want you to do something right now. Leave a comment and tell us, have you ever been ignored or blamed because of your age? Like this video so others who feel invisible can find it. Subscribe for more stories they don't want you to hear. Stories where silence turns into strength. Because your life didn't lose value with age. They just failed to see it in time.